a jail from 1862 through to 1972. It was a fully operational prison designed and built by the British penal system and installed and built here into Canada. And it was a horrendous place to be. It was terrible. There was lots of abuses and tortures and human rights violations, unfortunately. But to begin, when they would sentence people, they would sentence them in what used to be the old courthouse, which is next door, but they since shut down and turned it into an art gallery. But when they would sentence prisoners, what would happen was they would sentence them, and then they would shave their heads in case there was any kind of lye or infection or lice, shave their heads, strip them naked, and then would shackle them, and then spin them around about 10-20 times so they would be disoriented, and then they would blindfold them, and then they would lead people secretly up and into the jail via a secret underground stairwell, which is right here. This is the stairwell. We had to since cover it up because of legality and because back then too, there was also crawling with rats, so we had to cover it up so to keep that the detail down. And they would lead people up through the secret stairwell underneath the courthouse because they never wanted the prisoners to learn how they first got into the jail, because they felt as though that knowledge might lead to escape attempts and jailbreaks and information of that nature. And they would strip both the hair off of the men and the women. They would shave everybody and children too. So they really did not discriminate in terms of how they checked people in cruelly. And what's more was back then the Surgeon General of the jail in the 19th century had a weird specific job too, where he would take down all the details of all the prisoners, but he would also write things like whether or not prisoners could withstand corporal punishment or not. So he would literally write down, are they beatable or unbeatable on forms. And when corporal punishment did take place, it was quite brutal and no holds barred. And the Surgeon General always had to be present for all of them in case there was death at the time. And what's more, he also would specify things like educational level for the prisoners, whether they had elementary education or higher education, and also marital status. And weirdly and specifically, he would also write down whether prisoners had bad tempers. Like, are they ill-tempered or soft-tempered? It was a very weird specific system. And this information is actually displayed in the front lobby. So after the tour, you'll be able to see it in an old parchment form. And and so this stairwell is since covered up. And what I'm going to do now, everyone, is we're going to exit through here, and we're going to walk about 5 feet that way, and I will show you the literal solitary confinement. But before we do that, I want to point out that is a vintage door. That door is from the 19th century. That's a very hard-plated steel, and I just hope none of you have the same door as your bedroom door. So. Alrighty, so let's scooch down here, and then we'll take you to solitary confinement, which is nice but awesome. Okay. Alrighty, right over here. It was unaffectionately referred to as the hole because this was a terrible place to be. It was never heated, and it was never lit. There was never any light, and they would also cover up this door so that sound could never enter. So they absolutely deprived you of all physical senses. And what's more was that they also allowed lots and lots of rats and insects to just infest this place too. And your minimum sentence for being in solitary confinement was up to 12 hours a day. 12 hours was the minimum sentence, but if you were really uncooperative, they would extend the sentence for up to 6 months. 6 months, no light, no sound, no human interaction. They never allowed really any changes of clothes. And when they fed the prisoners, they oftentimes would give them a glass of water in the morning, and then a small plate of what was called gruel at the time. And gruel is this gross, disgusting, flat, gray porridge, like porridge. Anyway, so people would really not be fed very well. Maybe at holiday seasons they would get a piece of vegetables. And yeah, people were up to, and when the prison was overcrowded, the maximum population of the jail at the time was 150 people. But sometimes during overpopulation, they would crowd people into cells and would never really care or give them any kind of room or anything. So unfortunately, and quite literally, this was how many people would be in a cell at certain times. Like, this is how often and inconsiderate they were, even with the solitary confinement. Now, if everyone's okay with it, I could turn off this light for a moment and you could get the real full effect if everyone's comfortable or okay with that. Exactly. That's how stark and dark it was. It was just a terrible place to be. And what's more is if you were caught speaking or singing or crying or screaming, they would just extend your sentence for however long they deemed fit. Because the British Penal Code what was also known as the Bloody Code had no one to answer to, so they oftentimes, the guards would really be able to treat the prisoners however awfully they wanted to. And there was never any beds and never any pillows, and again, like I mentioned, never any changes of clothes, so it was very terrible. And it's very hard to see, but on the floor by the walls, right by your feet, are 2 chain links on the floor. And those chain links right there were where they would tie prisoners to the floor sometimes, and sometimes they would strap them full black down, naked, and really, really limited to let people to stand up. And there were oftentimes lots of beatings, lots of corporal punishments in here. And the most awful part of it all was that they would take care of sanitation in this way. It would give you a bucket, and they put it in the right-hand corner over here. Sorry, we're standing in the worst spot for that bit of information. But yeah, there would be a bucket down there, which they unpoetically referred to as a honey bucket. And they would only clean that maybe once every 2, maybe 3 days. So it was just awful, communal, and yuck. So yeah, so I just wanted to give you the full experience of the solitary confinement. We had never made this into a room before because we wanted to retain the historical value of this spot. And all right, so what we'll do now is we're going to vacate out of here. We'll head back to the breakfast area. Follow me, and there's a cool plaque right here if you want to read it. Philosopher named Jeremy Bertram. Jeremy Bertram was a British philosopher and social theorist who was very, very interested in prisons and prison reform. And what he would do was he developed this concept called the panopticon. And the panopticon was Mr. Bertram's concept of how to better police a better prison would be to build a tower right in the middle of it and install mirrors all along it so that prisoners would feel as though they were being watched at all times instead of always pure governance. And it actually kind of worked to curb down a lot of crime and a lot of escape attempts and make them, poor prisoners, psychologically feel as though they're being surveyed at all times. So with that employed, when they built and designed this prison in the 19th century, they adopted the panopticon via sound. That's the ceiling. The ceiling is specifically designed with these curvatures, which are called bell curve ceilings, and they put this in place so that the guards could hear the prisoners at all times. And so it would be just as loud as it is right now. Sorry about that. And the guards could hear if the prisoners were ever swearing or plotting anything. And yes, back in the 19th century, swearing was a capital offense, and you can be thrown into jail for up to 4 days just for swearing. And yes, I want to see that's why the whole place is always so echoey, and why you can hear like all across the other side of the jail, because there's extra means of security and enforcement. Now about the jail itself, this floor was known as the family prison, and back when it was in full operation, when they would sentence people who had families, they had no real social programs or social placement programs back then, so they would oftentimes just sentence people with their families into the jail. As opposed to, they didn't feel like separating the family unit was a very good idea, so they just took people and put them into this jail, which is really, really awful. And then after the year 1920 was when they shut down the family prison system and decided to just turn this into what was then a chapel. So they offer religious services in this area. And oftentimes they found the prisoners would turn to the church, not out of forgiveness or solace, but simply to get out of their cells for an hour of the day. And what's more is about the actual prisoners themselves. The youngest people to ever be put into the jail sentenced were a pair of brothers. They were ages 7 and 8. They were sentenced for capital crime of murder, unfortunately. And that was one of the only cases where they sentenced the boys to jail, but did not sentence the parents. So that was the one time they did break up the family unit. And the boys were so mistreated when they were in this jail that 4 years later, when they were released, they were so gaunt, pale, famished, and dehydrated that their parents did not even recognize them. They did not know who these two 13-year-olds were. 1 second. Alrighty. So what's more was the oldest prisoner to ever be sentenced into the jail was an older man at age 87, and he was sentenced for 4 days for drunkenness. So I would just imagine he would use that as a point of pride. I'm the oldest guy to ever stay here, and all I did was get drunk for 4 days. And yeah, so this was also, I'll show you some neat facts over here. In this corner over here, if you want to check it out, that was the stairwell used only for the guards themselves. But the significance of these stairs is that you'll notice these grates. What those are they're called anti-suicide bars. Because oftentimes prisoners would just leap off of this and to their deaths. And they didn't really care until a guard was on this floor, on the 9th floor, and in a violent altercation right here, he was thrown over top and he fell to his death at the very bottom. It's quite graphic. So after that day, they said that we don't need that to happen ever again. So they installed these suicide bars right here. Oftentimes the housekeeping staff and I will use to dry towels. I'm just kidding. And what's more about this area, well, you guys won't be able to see it, but anyway, over here there's a little circular alcove right there on level 6, right there. If you could look right there in the wall. What that was it was about 15 feet in deep, and we had to cover it up when it shut down. And it was an extra means of punishment. The guards would oftentimes tie prisoners up and then stick them into that slot and leave them there like food in the oven for probably about 2 days or however long they felt. And it was oftentimes, again, covered in blood and cold and dust and awful. And what's more was the jail itself. On levels 2, 4, and 6 were the prison itself. And levels 5 and 7 were the guard stations. And the prisoners never had heat. The jail was never heated between 1862 and 1972. So for 110 years, there was oftentimes never any heat and never any kind of taken care of for the prisoners. Whereas 5 and 7, where the guards and their families would stay, did have heat and amenities wholeheartedly. On level 9 up here used to be the hospital. And the hospital, when it was a jail, was deplorable. It was in terrible condition. There were oftentimes many amputations and sicknesses. And oftentimes they would only treat people at like arm's length. They would never get any close. It was always run by unqualified nurses. And it was only ever the female guards who escorted prisoners to the hospital area. They were called matrons at the time. The male guards were called patrons. And in 1951, I have to mention that the prison's hospital was terrible. No one ever took care of anyone, really, up to including the point where in 1951, when the city of Ottawa were building the Mackenzie King Bridge just over here outside the Rideau Center, when they were excavating, the engineers were digging deep, and they found 140 bodies. 140 bodies, oftentimes quite mangled and unrecognizable, missing several limbs. And the reason for that was because that was where they buried the prisoners unceremoniously and what they felt would always be anonymously. So yeah, the place really was quite awful. In terms of written history about the jail, that's quite suppressed. The government doesn't really want people to know too much about it. They kind of prefer to remain colloquial, but not really documented, unfortunately. So, and with everything I just mentioned and all the deprivation, dehydration, and mistreatment, the #1 complaint that the prisoners had when they stayed here was that they couldn't play cards. They couldn't play poker. That was actually the #1 complaint, was they would always have their decks of cards taken away from them. And again, most of the crimes were always like there were high crimes like treason and murder, but some of them unfortunately were very weird, specific, and small. Like if you were found caught disguised in a forest and off to jail. I don't know what that means. All I can think is, what were they disguised as? Batman? But another crime that people back in the 19th century in Ottawa were sentenced for was if you didn't shovel the driveway. Exactly, if you didn't shovel the driveway. So I can see a few parents here going, oh, what's the lesson there? Anyway, so I just wanted to point out a couple of the strange crimes as well as the high crimes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go into this floor right here, and we'll go on the left-hand side. But just before we do that, we're going to open this door. Sorry, one. I just want to point some neat architectural facts out. You won't really be able to see it. I'm going to actually pull that door kindly. Sorry, making you a doorman. You can't architecturally see it very well, but yeah, this is the original bar right here. So yeah, so what they would do is they would close the door right here, and then this would outstretch like that, and then clamp into the wall. So they had to remove this when it became a hostel in '72, because this would always hit people in the hip like me. But I just wanted to show you the old, ancient, very literal 19th century means of actually locking the cells. So there we go. All right, so we'll proceed over to this direction. Follow me. Thank you for your services. Regardless of whatever they thought was necessary, 80 people would be kept in the cell. And 80 people were going to come in there right now and standing there together. Well, I think we'll do that. Unless you choose to. But yeah, and what's more was this floor was the floor where they kept a minimum 2-year sentences. This one's empty, by the way, for like the full effect. This one doesn't have storage and our hostel stuff in it. And the jail itself was in operation from 1862 on, but they never ever introduced beds until the year 1900s. So people never actually got beds for the first 38 years that this place was in operation as a jail. And it didn't have the nice super intact structure. It was often cold brick. So again, there was lots of dust, mildew, and blood. And also insects and spiders crawling everywhere. And on this floor, they have only installed these windows here in the 20th century, but 1900 as well, actually. So these windows would be exposed. And if anyone has ever had the luxury of spending a winter in Ottawa, you'll know it's really cold. In fact, I believe the first 3 words of every Canadian child are, it's cold. Anyway, so these were really awful. And so people would often pass away from frostbite and hypothermia and pneumonia. And again, barely ever gave out blankets, if ever, or at all. And changes of clothes often only happened maybe once every 4 days. And how the cells were broken down would only ever be men in one cell and women in another cell. They very rarely let the 2 genders ever mix, but when it was overcrowded, they would. And also, these plates right here. You might be wondering what these plates are. they're actually the locking mechanisms. The clamp would come out here, stick in the groove, and then lock in here. And the engineers designed it to be just arm's length, actually, so that no one could reach out and then pick a lock and get it open. So yeah, it's very, very, very structurally sound. And yeah, this was the minimum 2-year sentence for. Now, a little history about actually the jail and Ottawa itself. One of the reasons why it was so corporal, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, a little history about Ottawa itself. It's the national capital city of Canada, but it wasn't always the national capital. The national capital used to be Kingston, Ontario. And Kingston, Ontario is about 2 hours south of Ottawa. And in the 1840s, 1850s, it was the national capital. But what happened was when they were developing Canada to become its own sovereign nation, its own democratic, separate from British overrule, they were thinking about, okay, let's make this country of our own. But the problem was the national capital, Kingston, is only 20 kilometers away from the United States border. Now, I'm not going to give the Americans a hard time. I love the United States. I've been to 21 states personally. However, in the 19th century, America had problems, shall we say. They were very, very, very mad at Canada for the War of 1812, and we successfully burned down a part of their White House. There was the Civil War going on in the mid-18th century. It was a big, big deal. And also the United States really didn't favor too well that Canada had no slavery laws the way they did. So with all that set in mind, Canada lived under the great threat of invasion. So they were very, very worried about invasion and attack. So they moved the national capital city from Kingston further north, 145 kilometers north, up to Ottawa, which is right here. But here's the catch. Ottawa in the 19th century was lawless. It was a wild, wild place to be. It was literally the Wild West. It was debauchery, alcohol, gambling, prostitution, and just a really, really crazy place. Like it is today. No, I'm just kidding. Oh yeah, I know Ottawa is often called the city that fun forgot. That's anyway. But so when they built this jail, they deliberately made it to be so corporal, violent, disgusting, and horrendous, and so that the reputation would get out, so that if you ever ended up in this jail, that would be a really terrible, terrible time for you. So that was why they actually kept it so terrible and corporal, was to temper Ottawa, to calm it down and make it so that it's not the place that it used to be. And yeah, that was one of the reasons why as well. That, the fact that the Bloody Code, which the British adopted, also did not have anyone to answer to. If you were a guard here, you could govern with impunity, which unfortunately is rather terrible. So what we're going to do now, everybody, is we're going to go to the opposite side of this very floor, and I'm going to show you a literal death row. And when we get there, just want you to remember that this is the only place in all of Canada that is both a jail, a museum, and a hostel. So you get all three in this building. And after you see death row, I will then show you literal gallows from the 19th century. Just like to build up this special. Follow me. On the wall right here. What they would do is the prisoners who were numerically in line to be hung, prisoner number 4 would be in that far cell, prisoner number 3 in this cell, prisoner number 2 in this cell, and then prisoner number 1 in this cell. And the reason why was because, for 2 reasons. They built the structure around it so that the prisoner would be in total isolation 24 hours before they were to be hung, so that they actually would have the time to repent and to think upon their sins. And they would be given their last meal, which oftentimes did not include alcohol or a cigarette, which was the #1 thing they only ever requested. There's oftentimes like a cold steak with some vegetables and potatoes with the side order of gruel. And what they would do was they would escort the prisoner from this cell dramatically down this hall past the others who were here, so to drive home the point. So they really, really, really made a point of people who were being made aware of what was going to come. And that's why also here the death row floor, our floors are wooded to make it extra dramatically loud so that the prisoners would hear what was coming, and also as an extra means of extra security, because when people are going to death row, they have really nothing to lose, unfortunately, so there oftentimes would be a lot of resistance. So they made the floor extra loud and echoey so that other guards would hear it and prevent any kind of upheaval. And yeah, this is a death row. The amount of people who were executed here has never actually been recorded on paper very accurately. But I know it was over 1,000. However, the top 3 most famous executions that ever took place here in Canadian history, though, were as follows in descending order. Number 3 was in 1946, a man named Eugene Larmont was hung and executed here for the murder of an Ottawa police officer. It being post-World War II, they felt that the murder of an Ottawa police officer had to be greatly publicly amended, so they really made a point of executing that gentleman. But then in 1933, the second most high-profile execution was a man named George Seabrook, and he was executed for being accused and convicted of the murder of an Ottawa gas station attendant. And it being 1933, the height of the Great Depression, we felt that an attack on a service worker or the gas station attendant would lead to a lot of theft and upheaval because of the desperation of the time. So they made a very grand point about him so that it would be dissuaded. But the number 1 person to ever be hung here, the most famous high-profile case, was in 1869, and his name was Patrick Whalen. And Patrick Whalen was a person of Irish descent, and he was living here in Ottawa. And what he was accused of was the murder of a man named Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And Thomas D'Arcy McGee in Canadian history was a very high-profile name. He was a parliamentarian. He was the one who signed the Confederation in 1867. He was the one who led Canada to become its own democratic nation. And he was the one who developed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Act, which was one of the very first to ever be designed in the British colony system. So he was a very big pioneer. Yes, it was Thomas D'Arcy McGee who said, hey, maybe the national capital of Canada shouldn't be in Kingston next door to our friends there. So yeah, he was very high profile, and he was one who founded Ottawa, built Parliament, and he was found murdered in February of 1867 at the corner of Elgin Street and Spark Street, which is just 2 blocks away. He was shot in the back on a cold winter's night. And what happened was it was so high profile that this community and the police could not leave that crime unsolved. So what they did was they just found the conviction as fast as they possibly could based on very flimsy circumstantial evidence. And what they did was they found Patrick Whalen just a block nearby, but he was drunk, just plain drunk. And they accused him of the murder just because he was the closest in proximity, and they convicted him on merely circumstantial evidence. So still to this day, it's oftentimes quite questionable whether or not Patrick Whalen was guilty or not. And I point out the reason why he was Irish was because in Ottawa at the time, we had a very large Irish community of about 5,000 people. And when they found out that this guy was being accused of that, they were worried about a great upheaval and riots. So much so that they were worried about riots and upheaval and political revolt. That what the system and the government did at the time was they told all of Ottawa that the execution of Patrick Whalen would take place on February 13th, 1869, but they did not do it on that date. They did it 2 days before. They did it on February 11th, so that no one would have anything to protest. So they deceived the community in that public execution. So still to this day, it's greatly questioned whether or not he really was guilty of the crime. And one more thing I will say, if anyone here is wondering whether or not the jail is haunted, the answer to that is absolutely, totally. So you're not alone in that sentiment. So what I'll do now is we're going to walk around that corner, and I will show you the literal gallows. Yeah, I can say get your cameras ready for this because cut the rope and it falls to the ground. And what's more is you might think that's an inefficient, wasteful use of rope, but no, there was never any limitation on the rope budget that the jail had at the time. And what's more is I got to mention this earlier, but about the actual executions themselves, they actually did measure how to humanely hang people by factoring in body weight and rope length, so that when prisoners were hung, they would plummet and the neck would simply snap and they would just die very humanely. But they did not do that for Patrick Whalen. They let him hang, and he said that he would hang, strangle, hung and strangled for 4 minutes. It was really dramatically for that. And they developed a system to hang in one game and without trying to work with weight. And the execution would be less. And other times, the head was decapitated, which is one point. And strangulation is like evil and awful. And speaking of the word evil, this place was referred to as an evil. Apparently, historically, the corporal punishment and beatings and hangings and weapons used were quite literally evil. So, all this manifests in the 20th century in Ottawa. And the little tiny window right here, if you're wondering what the point of that was, it actually used to have a wedge, a pulley attached to that. So it controls this tiny window here where they would pull it, and that's where the actual gallows would plummet and split open for the executions to take place. And when this was a jail, this is the original door right here, so it's fully intact and everything. When I was doing this tour a couple weeks ago, and someone placed a giant Kentucky Fried Chicken sticker right here. So I didn't think that was a part of when it was a jail, so I removed that. And what's more, what you're standing in right now is a courtyard. This courtyard here was for the guards themselves. This would be where the guards would hang out and play cards, which they never had to pay for. And the prisoners, what they would be offered when they were put into jail is if they had skilled trade and labor skills, they are often offered land sentences in exchange for services, laundry, or if you were a stonemason, because the reason why I put that out is this wall was built by the prisoners. This was the original stonemasonry offered by the prisoners in exchange for lighter sentences. So that's what you're looking at right here. Is this wasn't built by? Yeah, it was built by them. And that is the original door too from the 1860s. It is very, very varothaned and very well preserved. And all that said, I have actually seen a wedding here before. Yes, there were people who got married in this courtyard. That couple is still together to this day. They have 2 children. So, yeah, so what we're going to do now, everyone, I just wanted you to really get a feel for it. And about the courtyards themselves, before the Saw Gallery was built on the left-hand side over there, that was where the women's courtyard were. And on the right-hand side here, which is our parking lot, that's where the men's prison courtyard were. They were often let out into the sun for up to 12 hours a day in the summertime. No water. And were very limitedly let out during the wintertime. And if you were very, very, very unruly, you were just put into the hole where you never saw fresh air, unfortunately. So what I can do now is I find that us apostolars such as yourselves, it's not a judgment or anything, but often we don't drive. So what I find is hostelers often just enter through the front door and then exit through the front door. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you into the parking lot because I want to show you the whole physical structure of the building because it's cool. So I'm going to show you that right now. It's really neat and old. And that's what we're going to do now. And follow me. I am an Ottawa person. The reason why I point this out is when you grow up and live in Ottawa, most people who live here have no idea this is here.
we really don't know. People who live here, they would never stay in a hostel in their own city. So a lot of people who from Ottawa have no idea that downtown there's an old jail, which is an old hostel, to a point where every Uber that I take here, oftentimes they look at it and say, wait a minute, where am I going at 6:30 in the morning? And the guy says, oh, jail. It's like, oh, okay. Oh, yikes. Relax, I'm just serving breakfast. Okay, anyway. So I just wanted to point out that you're seeing, the reason why I say this is what you're seeing right now, most people who live here have never seen. They really don't know. So that's really neat and cool. And this is from the 1860s. And when it was shut down, the reason why and how this place was shut down was in the 1970s, there was a man whose name was Royal Majesty Prince Philip of the Duke of Edinburgh of England. Prince Philip was very big on British cultivation and British outlook and very PR for Great Britain. He really wanted Britain to be seen in a very positive light around the world. And so when he was doing so, and in his campaign to build up British morale, he realized that of all the British colonies, the very, very, very worst jail in the whole British Empire was in downtown Ottawa, the national capital of Britain's greatest ally, which is Canada, because we helped them in World War I and World War II. So we realized right in the downtown core, 1 kilometer away from Parliament Hill, where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Act was drafted, we said, okay, wait a minute, this jail can't possibly be as bad as people say it was. And he personally came to visit in October 1972 just to see how squalid and terrible and bloody, I mean very literally bloody, the halls and you get the idea. And when he went to go see it, he was so appalled by the conditions of the medieval structure and the lack of food and the people who were dehydrated and emaciated that he immediately said, okay, we're shutting this down right now. So he actually had the right to usurp the entire government of Canada. I just say, yeah, we're shutting this down immediately. No way, this isn't awesome. But Historical Preservationists and Heritage Canada and Archives Canada did meddle with this decision and said, okay, we'll shut it down, but you absolutely can't erase history and cannot destroy it. So they reached a compromise and they transformed it into a hostel. And that's what it became, is a hostel after that. However, we cannot erase the past in that this next fact about, I will recite to all of you, is personal. And I do mean very, very literally personal. But yours truly, Simon here, is dating a new woman. She's wonderful. Her name is Lacey. Lacey's great. But what happened was we went to dinner with her parents last April. I got to first meet her parents. And we're having a nice time. Things are going by great. And he said, so Simon, where do you work? He said, oh, I work at the Ottawa Jail Hostel. And normally I get, what's that? Or that's cool. Not this time. Her parents looked at me and said, where did you say you worked? The Ottawa Jail Hostel. 75 Nicholas Street? Yes. And both their parents just dropped their forks. They got really still and, wow. Yeah, we were imprisoned there. I said, what? Yeah, we were put into jail in that prison when we were 18 years old in 1968 for our political beliefs. I said, oh my goodness, wow. I said, yeah, this is not how we expected dinner to go. And then I asked them very sincerely, well, can I ask you guys to provide me any details for my tour? I think it would be very personal and relatable. And then both her parents looked at me and said, no, absolutely not, no. We don't want to talk about it. But what we're going to say to you, if you want to do us a justice and all the people who live in Ottawa still, who were in this jail, you will say on our behalf, just say this one sentence. It was a lot worse than you say it was. And I was like, wow, that is really, really, really deep and personal. So the reason why I bring that up is because, yeah, I mentioned earlier there's a lot of old archaic weapons that are used, and they don't display them out of sensitivity for the people of Ottawa who are alive to this day, who really did suffer at the hands of this establishment. Forgive me, my microphone. Yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. And again, this would be courtyard here, where the prisoners would be let out. They oftentimes would have not much to do. But someone did ask me recently about whether or not there was ever any escapes from the jail. And yes, there was, and you can see the physical evidence from where you're standing. On level 2 right there, you can see that window that has a hole cut out into it. Right there, that was a prisoner who was quite wealthy. And what he did was he would bribe the guards, like just pass some dough, and they provided him with a chisel, and he managed to secretly chisel his way out of there, and he managed to escape and run amok. But what happened was the police and the guard force set a trap. They betrayed the wealthy man, and when he ran out, there was all kinds of guards waiting here for him, and they nabbed him. And then what they did was they got everyone who was in the jail to stand over here, men and women and children too, unfortunately, and they beat the hell out of him right here and bludgeoned him to death right there, to a point to drive home that if you ever tried to escape, what happened to this guy would happen to you. And that's why they left the window there. They left that opening right there as a means of anyone who ever looked at it would have it in their minds that that's the fate that they would meet. And then also the Surgeon General would oversee and make sure that every prisoner was personally shown that, so that there would never be any escape attempts during when it was a jail. So that's why that intact structure right there. And I'll give you a few more points, and then what we'll do is we'll lead back to the front entrance, where there's just 2 more small facts that I want to show you about the front entrance. But I will say one last thing, which is the Royal Majesty, Prince Philip, also really saw how awful it was. So he was the one who hired an interior decorator and a botanist and a horticulturalist to install the vines and the trees to give this place a little less of an archaic, dark nature. So yeah, so what we'll do now is we'll go back to the front entrance, and I'll show you 2 more small things, and then the tour will conclude, and that's pretty much it. So follow me, everyone. And again, I will point out that this arch is originally from the 1860s, and the fact that it's perfectly designed and built for cars of today blows my mind. So yeah, they made the sharp spikes outside of it in the shape of the Quebec fleur-de-lis. Yeah, those are the shape where there is the symbol of Quebec, the Quebec fleur-de-lis. So they just did a subtle little dig at Quebec. I think it's kind of hilarious, because there's no place in the world where the sharp spikes outside the jail are the shape of the Quebec fleur-de-lis. And I just wanted to point that little neat small fact out. And that's where the prisoners would always exit. And this little entrance right here that says jail entrance was where the guards would come to and from. And lastly, if anybody wants a fun, goofy picture taken, what you do is you go over here, and then you just stick your head in like so, and go, ah, I'm in jail. So this is your, oh, okay, I'm modeling apparently. And just for the record, this thing is not an original from the 1860s. This was built in like 1999. This is just a fun goofiness. So if you want a little memento, I recommend this. And lastly, I will say that that is the tour, everyone. I hope you enjoy your travels. I hope you enjoy Ottawa. And this is just my own personal thing. It has absolutely nothing to do with what you just heard. But if anybody likes good Mexican food, there's a little place called Corazon de Maíz. It's inside of the Broward Market Pavilion on the western side of it. They make really, 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 really good Mexican food. Highly recommend that if you're interested in Mexican food. Other than that, I wish you safe travels. I've been Simon. Thank you very, very much for being a part of this all. Alrighty. And I do have a background in stand-up, so that's why I tried to make this a little funny. Alrighty, I wish you safe travels, and if you have any more questions about anything, please don't hesitate to ask. And yeah, if anybody wants me to take their goofy pictures with this, I'd be happy to do that for you. Alrighty.